My name is Evelyn Hart, and on the morning my father was laid to rest, I thought the worst pain I would feel was grief. I was wrong. The church smelled faintly of old hymn books and lilies, the kind my father always said made him sneeze, even though he secretly loved them. Sunlight filtered through stained glass windows and cast warm patches of gold across the oak casket draped with a Marine Corps flag. I stood only a few feet away, staring at the nameplate that read Thomas Hart, my father, my anchor, my one steady truth in a life that had never stopped shifting beneath my feet. People whispered soft condolences as they passed me, hands brushing my arm, their sympathy gentle and sincere. But all the warmth in that room evaporated the moment the heavy double doors swung open and my mother walked in. My stomach tightened. Linda Hart did not enter with grief. She entered with Ray Dalton. Ray, the man who had hovered around our family for more than 20 years like a storm cloud refusing to move. Ray, who had contributed nothing to our lives except chaos and fear. They walked in laughing as if they were arriving at a barbecue rather than a funeral. Ray reeked of stale beer and cheap aftershave. My mother wore a tight dress better suited for a nightclub than a place of mourning. The room fell into a stunned silence. I felt dozens of eyes shift from me to them, then back to me, searching my face for an explanation I did not have. Linda sauntered up the aisle, her heels clicking loudly on the polished floor. She stopped beside the casket and looked down at my father with an expression that was not sadness but irritation, as if he were somehow inconveniencing her by being dead. Then she said the sentence that sliced through the quiet like a blade. He left nothing behind but debt and junk. We deserve this land more than he ever did. A few guests gasped. Someone quietly said, "God help her." I stepped forward, heat rising in my chest. Dad built everything here with his own hands. You bled him dry. The slap came so quickly my head snapped to the side. My mother's palm stung against my cheek, and for a moment the world blurred. "Evelyn, lower your voice," she hissed, as if I were the disgrace in the room. Ray stepped closer. His jaw tightened. He squinted at me with that same mean look he had used on me since I was a kid. "Say that again, nurse girl." My pulse hammered in my ears. I could have walked away. I could have stayed silent. But something in me cracked. Maybe it was the sight of my father's folded flag. Maybe it was the years of watching this man chip away at my family. Or maybe it was simply time to stop letting fear govern my life. Parasites do not get to rewrite a good man's life. Ray's expression shifted. Not to anger. To something darker. A thin smile twitched on his lips. He reached into the pocket of his jeans, and before anyone could react, he flicked open a folding knife. A real one. Not a threat, not a bluff, but cold steel glinting under the church lights. Someone screamed. People stumbled back pews, scraping loudly across the floor. I felt my breath stall in my chest. Ray moved fast, faster than a drunk man should be able to move. In one motion, he stepped forward, grabbed my shoulder, and drove the knife into my abdomen. A burning shock radiated outward, a hot bloom of pain that stole the air from my lungs. It felt surreal, like the world had tilted without warning. The church spun. My knees buckled. I heard my own gasp more than I felt it. Hands reached for me, but I was already falling. I hit the floor hard, my palms sliding across the glossy wood. Warmth spread beneath my dress. The metallic scent of blood reached my nose. I looked up through dimming vision just in time to see Ray stumbling backward, the knife still in his hand. But what struck me harder than the pain was the sight of my mother. She did not run to me. She did not scream my name. She did not kneel beside her only child as I lay bleeding on the church floor. Instead, Linda grabbed Ray by the wrist, tugged him toward the exit, and fled. Not even a backward glance. Not even a moment of hesitation. The last thing I saw before the darkness closed in was her silhouette disappearing through the doorway, her hand still wrapped around the man who had stabbed me, Mom, running, leaving me to die beside my father's casket. The world went black. When I was a child, I thought my father could lift the entire world with his bare hands. Thomas Hart was a Marine for 20 years, the kind of man who woke before sunrise, brewed coffee strong enough to peel paint off the walls, and believed every problem in life had a solution if you faced it head on. After he retired honorably, he used his military savings to buy a stretch of land outside Asheville. 12 acres of quiet pine trees and rolling hills, the kind of place that felt like exhaling after holding your breath for too long. He built our house himself, plank by plank. He built his workshop behind it, a sturdy barn-turned-carpentry studio that hummed with sawdust and old country music. And for a long time, the land felt safe. The house felt safe. He felt safe. My mother, Linda, was different. She had not grown up with much, and she never missed a chance to remind people. She told the story so often that even I could recite it. First generation to finish high school, first to have a car without a broken window, first to marry a man with a pension coming. My father thought he was offering her stability and a life they could build together. She thought she was marrying a ladder. I noticed the shift when I was about 10 years old. My father still smiled when he came home, still dusted wood shavings from his sleeves before hugging me, still crouched beside me as I did my homework. But my mother began drifting. First, it was long errands that kept her out late, then lunches that apparently stretched 5 hours, then weekend trips to see old friends. Dad never complained. He just cooked dinner, left her plate warming in the oven, and told me that grown-ups got busy sometimes. But even then, I could feel something sour twisting in our house. The day I met Ray Dalton is a memory that never loosened its grip on me. I came home from school with a drawing I was proud of, a crude sketch of an eagle I made for my dad because he told me once he missed seeing them during deployments. When I ran inside, Ray was sitting at our kitchen table. His boots were on the chair next to him, mud flaking onto the floor. He had an arm slung around the back of my mother's chair like he owned the place. My mother's smile toward him was soft in a way she never used on Dad anymore. My father walked in a minute later holding a bag of screws he must have picked up from the hardware store, and the air in that kitchen thickened so fast it felt like someone had closed a door on all of us. That night I heard shouting through my bedroom wall, my mother yelling that she deserved more. Ray yelling something back then, a heavy thud, then silence. The next morning, Dad had a bruise on his arm shaped like a boot, but he just ruffled my hair and told me breakfast was ready. As the years went on, Ray became a permanent shadow in our lives. He was always around, always wanting something, always turning our house into a place where I kept my shoes on and my backpack beside the door in case I needed to leave quickly. He drank a lot. He yelled even more. He once threw a hammer across the workshop because Dad would not loan him money. It hit a shelf of lacquered bowls Dad had been preparing for a local craft fair, shattering half of them. Ray laughed like it was funny. My mother told my father he was being dramatic. I learned early that silence was safer and that quiet people survive longer in loud homes. So I studied. I stayed late at school. I volunteered at the community center. When I was 16, my father picked me up from a late shift and said he had something to show me. He drove us to the hospital he had taken me to for asthma attacks when I was little. He walked me through the halls, pointing out nurses who nodded warmly to him. He said he used to bring furniture he built for their break rooms. Then he said something that changed everything. You would be good at this. You care about people. You are steady. You do not run. I looked at the nurses bustling from room to room, calm, even in chaos, and for the first time in my life, I felt a future forming. After that, becoming a nurse was the only thing that made sense. I wanted to help people. I wanted to escape. I wanted my own life, one that was not constantly shaped by my mother's disappointments or Ray's rage. My father supported me completely. He filled out financial aid papers with me at the kitchen table. He drove me to college tours hours away. He left handmade wooden frames on my dorm desk with notes that said, "You can do hard things and proud of you, kid." My mother told me a nurse was just a maid in scrubs and asked why I bothered with school when I could just find a husband. She said it so often that Ray eventually repeated it like a joke. A maid in scrubs. As if the work I wanted to do was worthless. As if compassion were something to mock. When I earned my license and took my first job in the emergency department, my father brought flowers to my tiny apartment. He hugged me and whispered, "I knew you would make it." That same night, my mother and Ray showed up uninvited. They said they wanted to celebrate even though they never celebrated anything of mine. They stayed until Ray got drunk and knocked over a lamp. My landlord issued a warning. My father apologized even though none of it had been his fault. Over the next decade, I built a life around the hospital halls. I worked trauma nights, high adrenaline shifts, cardiac arrests, car crashes, overdoses, gunshots. I held the hands of people taking their last breaths. I stitched up the drunk and the broken. I carried grief home like an invisible coat. But I also knew how to stand firm. I knew how to keep a pulse steady, how to talk families through the unthinkable, and how to remain calm in the moments that split a life into before and after. All skills that would matter more than I ever imagined. Because even as I grew stronger, my father grew quieter. He visited less. He became tired. He called one night and said Linda and Ray were pressuring him to sign some papers about the land. Something felt wrong. I offered to drive home immediately, but he told me not to worry. He said he was taking care of it. He always said that. I never imagined that the next time I stood beside him, he would be lying still in a casket, and that the people who made his life hell would try to take everything he built, including my life. The older I became, the harder it was to ignore the red flags that had been waving around my mother and Ray for years. When I was a kid, those moments felt confusing and frightening, the kinds of scenes I tried to forget because remembering them made home feel unsafe. But as an adult, especially once I started working as a trauma nurse, I realized how unmistakable the signs had been. Patterns of manipulation, cycles of abuse, a steady erosion of my father's spirit disguised as household tension. After I moved out for college, their behavior escalated in ways that were impossible to hide. Every time I visited a home, I found a new crack in the foundation of the life my father had built so carefully. One afternoon, about 8 years before his death, I arrived unannounced to surprise him for his birthday. I still had my student ID on a lanyard around my neck, scrubs peeking out from my backpack. When I pulled into the gravel driveway, my father's truck was parked outside the workshop, but the house door was wide open. I heard shouting from inside. I entered quietly and saw Ray standing in the living room with a beer bottle in one hand, pointing the other hand in my father's face. "You owe us." Ray was snarling. "You owe us for everything we put up with." My father stood still, his jaw clenched, a stiffness in his shoulders that I recognized from stories of his deployments. He said in a measured voice that he was not handing over money, not $1, and that Ray needed to leave. My mother sat on the couch, arms crossed, watching the argument as if it were a television show she was too bored to change the channel on. When she noticed me, she rolled her eyes and stood. "Great. The nurse is here," she said. My father sighed with relief when he saw me. He stepped toward me, but Ray moved faster. He blocked my father with a shove that would have sent him to the ground if he had not grabbed the table for balance. I stepped forward in reflex muscle memory honed from years of crisis training, but my father shot me a warning look that said one wrong move would make things worse. That was the first time I seriously wondered whether my mother and Ray might actually be dangerous. But it was far from the last. There were always new stories waiting for me each time I visited. A hammer thrown at a wall, a cabinet door ripped off its hinges, a workshop tool gone missing, a checkbook misplaced. Ray liked to smash things. My mother liked to blame my father for being upset about it. The police showed up at least 4 times over the years, according to the neighbors. They lived far enough apart that calls did not always reach me quickly. But when they did, the stories followed a familiar script. Ray screaming in the yard, my mother yelling back, something heavy hitting the side of the house, my father trying to calm them down. The officers leaving after my father insisted everything was fine. My father was a proud man, but pride was not what kept him silent. Loyalty was. He believed family was worth fighting for even when the only person fighting was him. He believed things could be fixed. He believed my mother was still the young woman he once loved rather than the bitter version of herself she had become. One summer, he confided in me that Ray had been pressuring him to co-sign a loan. Apparently, Ray had some business venture, a scheme that involved flipping old machinery and selling parts. The problem was that Ray had no credit and no steady income. The bank refused to approve anything. So Ray wanted my father to sign. Dad refused, of course. My mother sided with Ray and accused my father of being selfish. That same week, Ray broke 2 chairs in the workshop. My father told me he might put cameras in the barn to protect himself. When I suggested involving a lawyer, he shook his head and said he did not want to escalate the situation. My mother had a skill for twisting the story to make herself look like the victim. If my father mentioned separating, she accused him of abandoning her. If he suggested counseling, she called him weak. If he tried to set boundaries, she shattered them deliberately. She had a way of looking at him that drained the light from his eyes. A mixture of disdain and entitlement, an attitude that said everything he earned should belong to her, simply because she existed nearby. But the moment I realized just how far they had gone was the day I walked into the workshop and saw a stack of bank documents on the bench. They were scattered unsigned and clearly taken from my father's file cabinet. Loan applications, property assessment forms, a half-completed equity line request that listed my mother as sole beneficiary. Ray stood behind me, leaning on the doorframe, arms crossed over his chest. "One day, all this land will be ours," he said. The tone in his voice made my skin crawl. It was not a threat. It was a promise. When I confronted my father later, he admitted that Ray had been trying to force him to sign papers that would transfer partial ownership of the land. They told him he was old-fashioned, that he did not need all that property, that they could help him manage things. He refused. He was firm. He was steady. But I could hear the exhaustion in his voice. Being constantly attacked by the 2 people who should have supported him was wearing him down. The next red flag came a year later when I visited for Christmas. My father looked thin, his shoulders slumped, his face lined with quiet stress. My mother barely spoke to me. Ray made a comment about how nice it would be if I moved back home to support them. Support them, not my father. I said no, and Ray's expression darkened. My father pulled me aside later that night and said not to worry, that he was handling it. But when I asked if he felt safe, he hesitated just long enough for fear to settle in my stomach. I began calling more often. Sometimes my father answered with a calm voice. Other times he sounded distant, as if he were choosing his words carefully because someone was listening. My mother never answered. When she finally did return one of my calls, she accused me of abandoning her and treating her like a burden. She said Ray was the only one who cared about her. The final sign that something irreversible had shifted came 6 weeks before my father's death. I arrived home after a double shift to find 3 missed calls from him. When I called back, he sounded shaken. Not crying. My father never cried, but unsettled in a way I had never heard before. He said they had tried something again, something about papers, something about the land. Before I could ask more, he said he had it under control, that he did not want me driving home exhausted, and that we could talk the next day. The next day never came. And looking back now, every warning sign, every moment of tension, every red flag that I tried to reason away had been pointing to one terrifying truth. They had wanted what he had, and they would do anything to get it. In the months before my father died, I began to see clearly just how long he had been fighting alone. He never wanted to worry me, so he carried the weight of everything with the quiet dignity he had learned in the Marines. But beneath his steady voice and patient smile, there was a man who had been defending his home, his land, and his legacy against 2 people who should never have been his enemies. One evening, about 4 months before his death, I drove home after a long week in the emergency department. I had not planned a visit, but something in my father's voice during our last phone call nagged at me. He said things were fine too quickly. He said he was handling it, but his tone had a tightness that did not match the words. When I turned onto the gravel road leading to the property, I saw him outside the workshop. He was sitting on a stump near the barn door, elbows on his knees, staring at the ground as if trying to find answers in the dust. When he heard my car door close, he stood and smiled. But the smile was thin. He hugged me, and I felt how much weight he had lost. He smelled like cedar shavings and coffee, the smell of my childhood. Inside the workshop, everything was tidy. Dad always kept his tools in perfect order, the way Marines keep their gear squared away. But even in the neatness, I felt tension lingering like static in the air. He motioned for me to sit on a stool while he pulled up his old metal chair, the one with the worn cushion he had used for years. He rested his hands on his knees. exhaled slowly, and said something I had never heard from him before. "I think I need help." The words stunned me. My father never asked for help, not even when he injured his shoulder lifting lumber, not even when he had pneumonia years earlier. He always pushed through. He always managed. For him to say that meant things were worse than I imagined. He told me he had been recording video diaries on a small handheld camera. He had been doing it for months. He said his memory was fine, but he wanted a record. Something undeniable. Something he could show a lawyer if things got worse. He opened a drawer and pulled out the camera. The screen was scratched, but when he pressed play on the latest video file, the workshop filled with his own voice. The recording showed him sitting in the same chair, the date stamp marking it from 3 nights earlier. He looked tired, drained in a way I had never seen before. In the video, my father said he was worried. He said Linda and Ray had been pushing harder, getting angrier, demanding he sign papers, transferring partial ownership of the land. He said they had tried to convince him that I was ungrateful, that I would never take care of him, and that the land should belong to them since they planned to build something with it. He said Ray had threatened him during an argument. Not directly, but with the kind of threat that hides between the lines. Something like accidents happen. The kind of statement that leaves a stain on the air long after the words fade. When the video ended, my father turned off the camera and rubbed his forehead. He looked older than his 62 years. I reached out and held his hand. The grip was strong, but I felt the tremor beneath the strength. He said he had already spoken to Michael Reeves, an old friend from his Marine days who had become an attorney in Asheville. Reeves had suggested updating his will and preparing a transfer on death deed for the house, the workshop, and the land. That way, when my father died, everything would go directly to me without a chance for interference. My father said he had already signed the paperwork. Reeves was supposed to file it the following week. My father exhaled again, the kind of breath that seemed to leave him empty. He said he knew my mother would never forgive him for protecting me. He said he had spent years trying to believe she would change, that she would remember the good years, that she would see how far he had bent to keep their family stable. But nothing was ever enough for her. She always wanted more, and she always wanted the fastest way to get it, even if it meant tearing down the man who had given her everything. My father stood, walked to the open barn door, and stared out at the treetops swaying in the wind. He said softly that he feared they might try something desperate. When I stepped beside him, he placed his hand on my shoulder, steady and warm. "If anything happens to me, you go straight to Reeves. Do not wait. Do not argue. Promise me. Dad, nothing is going to happen to you." I tried to speak with confidence, but fear clawed at my chest. He smiled sadly, the kind of smile that holds too much truth. I hugged him, and he hugged me back tightly. The next morning, I cooked him breakfast and tried to get him to come stay with me in Asheville. He refused. He said someone needed to take care of the workshop, that he had orders to finish, that he was fine. But I could see he was not fine. When I left that afternoon, he waved from the porch until my car disappeared down the road. I can still picture him standing there, arms crossed, watching with that protective look he always had. 2 weeks later, I received the phone call. My mother said he had fallen down the stairs. She said it was an accident, but her voice was flat, cold, mechanical. By the time I reached the house, the paramedics were gone. The only thing left was a sheet on the floor where his body had been, and my mother's irritated expression as she said she had already told the officers what happened. They ruled it accidental, but the moment I stepped into that house, I felt an unease that never left me. Something was wrong. Something was missing. My father, who had spent his entire life surviving danger and protecting others, would not simply fall down a staircase. The truth was that he had been fighting a private war for years, and now he was gone. And the people who had pushed him the hardest were already circling the land he fought so hard to protect. In the days following my father's death, the house felt hollow. It was the same place I had grown up in, the same familiar walls and wooden floors, the same scent of pine drifting from the workshop out back, but everything inside it felt corrupted, as if someone had drained all the warmth and left only a shell. My mother moved through the rooms like she was doing inventory, not grieving. She opened cabinets, rearranged drawers, sifted through my father's belongings with a sharp, impatient energy that made my skin crawl. She acted less like a widow and more like someone preparing for a sale. On the third morning, she called me into the living room with a tone that suggested she expected obedience. When I walked in, Ray was sitting on the couch with his feet propped on the coffee table my father built. My mother stood beside him holding a thick envelope of documents. She lifted her chin and said, "Your father left the land to me. All of it." The words hit like ice water. I asked her to repeat it. She handed me a stack of papers, her nails tapping impatiently against the manila folder. Ray leaned back with a smug grin, like he had already moved in and redecorated the place. "According to these," she said, "your father signed a deed transferring the house workshop and all 12 acres to me before he died." I scanned the documents. They were copies of a quitclaim deed with signatures that looked like my father's handwriting at a glance. But they were wrong. The loops were off. The angle of his signature slanted in a direction he never used. The notary stamp was smudged and missing a county line. I told her the signatures were forged. She shrugged. Maybe he was tired when he signed. Maybe he trusted Ray to fill out the details. People do that when they are declining. The casual cruelty of her voice made something inside me tighten. Ray chimed in saying Tom wanted us to have this place. "He told me so. He said you do not care about him like we did." The audacity made my stomach twist. My father had spent years being drained, manipulated, and trapped in a toxic cycle, and now they stood in his living room rewriting his last wishes. They were not even mourning. They were claiming, taking, consuming. I asked where the original documents were. My mother smiled thinly. "Gone. Put away. Not your concern." I demanded to see them, but she refused. Ray stood and blocked my path, his presence heavy and threatening. He told me I should be grateful they were even telling me anything at all. I told them I was going to speak with an attorney. My mother laughed a cold, humorless sound. "You think anyone will believe you over his wife? The land is mine now. The workshop, too. Everything he built is finally where it belongs." In that moment, I realized she had not only expected this outcome, she had planned for it. She and Ray had been circling my father's property like vultures long before he died. When I left the house, my hands were shaking. The cold mountain air burned as I inhaled, trying to clear my head. I walked to the workshop needing a moment of grounding, needing to feel close to my father in the place he loved most. But when I pushed open the door, the room felt wrong. The workbenches were scattered, drawers hung open. The cabinet where he kept important papers had been emptied. The safe was unlocked, swung open, and completely wiped out. The USB drive containing his project designs and financial records was gone. His envelopes of receipts were missing. All the labeled folders he kept for tax purposes were nowhere in sight. My heart began to pound. They had stripped everything of value, not just possessions, evidence, anything that could prove my father's intentions, anything that could tie into his will or the transfer on death deed. I searched every corner of the workshop, checking behind toolboxes beneath tarps under the old lathe he used for turning bowls. Nothing. The place looked like it had been raided. When I walked outside, one of our neighbors, Carol, stood near the fence line. She had been friends with my father for years and had brought him soup after surgeries helped him haul lumber and kept an eye on the property during storms. She looked at me with concern. "Honey, I am so sorry," she said. I nodded, unable to speak for a moment. She stepped closer and lowered her voice. "Your dad told me he updated his will. He told me to make sure you talked to Reeves if anything ever happened to him." My breath caught. I asked her when he had said that. She said 2 weeks before he died. He had stopped by her house and told her he was worried. He did not give details, but he was adamant that I needed to go to the lawyer if things ever went wrong. She placed a hand on my arm as she continued. "Your dad was scared." I have never seen him scared before. That was the moment I understood the depth of the danger he had been facing. My father was a Marine who had survived deployments, hurricanes, financial hardship, and years of emotional warfare at home. If something frightened him enough to warn the neighbors, then whatever he knew was serious. I drove straight to his bedroom, opened the drawers he always kept locked, and searched for anything he might have hidden. Nothing was left. Not even the small box where he kept old letters from me. Everything had vanished. My mother and Ray claimed they had cleaned up, but the truth was obvious. They had scrubbed the house of every document that could protect me or prove their lies. I confronted my mother about the missing files. She shrugged. Maybe your father misplaced them. Maybe you did. Then she turned away with a dismissive flick of her wrist as if my father's entire life were something she could toss aside and replace with a new narrative she preferred. That was when I understood she was not only complicit, she was leading it. The next day, when I returned to gather a few of my father's personal items, the door to the house was locked. My mother opened it only an inch and said she needed space. When I tried to step inside, Ray appeared behind her, arms folded, blocking the doorway. My mother stared at me with cold triumph. You do not live here. You have no rights here. Leave. And then she shut the door in my face. That single moment ignited something fierce inside me. They thought they had won. They thought they could erase every trace of my father's truth and rewrite history to benefit themselves. They thought I would walk away, but they underestimated the one thing my father had given me that they could never touch: his resolve, his steadiness, his refusal to be defeated by cruelty. And I knew then that whatever came next, I would not back down. They wanted my father's land. They wanted everything he built. But before this was over, they would learn that I inherited more from him than a deed. I inherited his fight. The morning after being locked out of my childhood home, I drove straight to Asheville with a knot in my stomach so tight it felt like a fist pressing against my ribs. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my father's workshop, ransacked his documents, missing my mother's cold stare through the cracked door as she told me I had no rights. I replayed every conversation I had ever had with him in those last months, searching for clues I might have missed. There must have been something he left for me, something they had not destroyed or stolen. My father was too careful, too deliberate, too aware of danger to leave me with nothing. The office of Attorney Michael Reeves sat inside an old brick building downtown, the kind with narrow hallways and framed diplomas lining the walls. I had only met him twice when I was younger at community cookouts, where he and my father exchanged stories only Marines understood. When I stepped inside, a receptionist with silver hair and a warm voice led me to a small room. Reeves entered a few minutes later. He looked older than I remembered, his hair grayer, his shoulders broader but slightly slouched, as if carrying decades of clients' burdens. Still, when he saw me, his expression softened with recognition. "Evelyn, your father spoke of you often." I swallowed hard and said I needed answers. He nodded and closed the door behind him. He did not start with condolences or small talk. Instead, he reached into a filing cabinet and pulled out a thick brown envelope bound with a rubber band. He placed it gently on the desk between us, almost reverently. "Your father came to see me 6 times over the past few months," Reeves said quietly. He was worried. Very worried. The words felt like an echo of what I had feared. Reeves continued. "He told me he did not trust what was happening at home. He said he was afraid your mother and Ray were trying to pressure him into signing away the property. I told him the only way to secure the land for you was through very specific legal documentation. A will, and something even stronger, a transfer on death deed." My breath caught. He had mentioned it to me once, but only vaguely. Reeves opened the envelope and removed 2 sets of documents wrapped in plastic sleeves. He handed me the first. It was my father's updated will, fully notarized, dated 6 weeks before he died. My name appeared throughout the pages. Sole beneficiary, sole executor, sole inheritor of the land, the workshop, and every asset he owned. Tears stung my eyes. Reeves handed me the second sleeve. This was the transfer on death deed. It was notarized, recorded, and stamped properly by the county office. I stared at it, trembling. So this was real. My father had protected me fully. He had done everything right. The law was on my side. Reeves reached into the envelope again and placed a small silver flash drive on the table. Then he set down a second one, and a third. "Your father asked me to hold these until after his death. He said that if anything happened to him, you would need them." My heart raced. I asked what was on them. Reeves folded his hands. "I have watched them. There are video diaries, many of them. Some were filmed in his workshop, others were filmed in his truck or on the property. He spoke about everything he had been going through, the pressure, the arguments, the threats. He paused, choosing his words with care. He said he believed someone might try to harm him. The room seemed to tilt. I felt as if gravity had shifted under my chair. Reeves handed me the first flash drive. I plugged it into my phone with an adapter I kept in my bag for work. A folder popped up on my screen labeled Heart Files. There were 19 video files inside. I clicked on the first. The screen filled with my father's face. He sat in his workshop, the soft hum of distant machinery vibrating behind him. His expression was tired but resolute. "If you're watching this kid, something has gone wrong." My throat tightened. He continued, "Linda and Ray want the land. They want everything. I do not know how far they will go, but I know what they are capable of. They have tried to get me to sign papers I do not trust. I am not giving them what I built. This land goes to you." He ended the video with a sigh and a weary smile. I watched the next file, and the next. With each video, the dread in my chest grew heavier. He recorded everything. The days Ray showed up drunk and screamed outside the workshop. The nights my mother locked herself in the bedroom and refused to speak to him unless he agreed to her demands. The argument where Ray slammed my father's shoulder into a door frame. The moment my father told my mother he was leaving everything to me. The way she looked at him afterward, her voice cold as she told him he was throwing his life away. File after file, he documented lies, threats, manipulation, and fear. The last video was the hardest. He sat closer to the camera, his face pale under the workshop lights. His voice was low. "If this is the last recording, then it means I did not make it to Reeves in time. It means they finally got what they were after. Do not let them take the land. Do not let them erase what I built. You are stronger than you think. I love you, kid. Take this and fight." The video ended. My hands shook so badly I almost dropped the phone. Reeves sat quietly, letting me absorb it all. When I finally managed to speak, my voice came out hoarse. "How did they get the other papers filed so fast after he died?" Reeves took a deep breath. "I had the documents ready, but your father passed away before I could submit them. I learned about his death from the obituary published 48 hours later. And by the time I attempted to file everything, your mother had already submitted fraudulent paperwork to the county. She moved incredibly fast. Too fast for someone who had just lost a husband." I stared at the table. It felt like the world had been rearranged and someone had forgotten to tell me where anything belonged. Reeves leaned forward. "You need to take this to the sheriff. These videos are evidence. This is not just fraud. This is possibly a suspicious death." My heart pounded. Suspicious death. The words felt heavy, real, terrifying. Reeves added that the transfer on death deed would override everything if verified, but we had to act quickly. We had to secure the evidence before it disappeared. I asked him if he believed my father's death was an accident. Reeves did not answer immediately. Instead, he opened the folder of documents again, placed the will and deed in front of me, and said carefully, "I think your father knew something was coming, and I think he tried everything he could to prepare you for this moment." I left his office with the envelope, the flash drives, and a rising determination burning through the grief. My father had not left me defenseless. He had left me a roadmap, a truth, a warning, and a fight he trusted me to finish. The morning of my father's funeral began with a sharp cold that clung to the air like mist. Asheville's small mountain churches often looked gentle in the early light, but that day everything felt tense, as though the world itself knew something was about to rupture. I arrived early with the few of my father's closest friends, helping the pastor arrange the Marine Corps flag across the casket and placing a small carved wooden eagle my father had made beside it. People trickled in slowly, quiet and respectful, most of them neighbors who had known my father for decades. They spoke about him in soft tones, stories of his kindness, his loyalty, his stubborn humor. Every time someone touched my arm and said he was a good man, the grief hit me again like a wave. The pews filled, the room warmed with bodies and whispered condolences. Then the double doors slammed open. The sound cracked through the church like a gunshot. Everyone turned. My mother entered first wearing a tight black dress that looked more suited for a party than a funeral. Behind her walked Ray Dalton, noticeably unshaven, his hair slicked back in a sloppy attempt to appear presentable. His shirt was wrinkled. His breath carried the sharp edge of alcohol even from several steps away. They walked down the aisle as if they owned the place. Heads turned. Murmurs rippled through the room. My mother's smile was thin, satisfied, almost triumphant. When she stopped at the head of the casket, she glanced at my father with the same casual disinterest she used whenever she inspected groceries at the store. Then she said something so callous, so openly cruel, that even the pastor inhaled sharply. He left nothing behind but debt and junk. We deserve this land more than he ever did. I froze. The guests froze. The church went dead silent. My pulse hammered in my ears. When I stepped forward, it felt like my feet moved before I consciously made the choice. I stood between her and the casket. Dad built everything here with his own hands. You bled him dry. The look my mother gave me was not grief. It was annoyance, like I was interrupting something important. She slapped me so hard my head turned. Gasps filled the room. A woman in the front row whispered, "Dear God." Ray stepped forward, his eyes narrowing, his voice dripping with contempt. "Say that again, nurse girl." He said nurse girl the way some people say garbage. I steadied myself, my cheek burning, my heart pounding. Parasites do not get to rewrite a good man's life. Ray's jaw clenched. Something changed in his expression, something low and dangerous. A look I had seen only once before when he broke my father's workshop chairs in a fit of rage. It was a look that meant someone was about to get hurt. He reached into the pocket of his jeans. I saw the flick of his thumb, the unmistakable sound of metal snapping into place. A folding knife, the kind hundreds of men in North Carolina carried, legal, common, and in the wrong hands, lethal. A woman screamed. Ray lunged. He moved fast, shockingly fast, with a precision that suggested this was not the first time he had raised a knife at someone. I stepped back, but not far enough. Pain exploded through my abdomen like hot lightning. It was not a slicing pain. It was blunt and sharp all at once, hitting deep and punching the air out of my lungs. My hands flew to my stomach, and I felt warmth spreading beneath my dress. My knees buckled. I collapsed onto the polished wooden floor. The ceiling blurred. Voices echoed from different directions, frantic and sharp-edged. "Call 911. He stabbed her. "Oh my God! Someone get the pastor!" People backed against the pews, fear radiating through the room as panic set in. The pastor tried to approach, but my mother stepped in front of him, grabbing Ray by the sleeve. Her voice was sharp, urgent, but not with concern. With fear of consequence. "Come on, we have to go. Now." She was not afraid for me. She was afraid of getting caught. Ray stared down at me, his chest heaving, his pupils blown wide. For a moment, he looked almost surprised by what he had done, like it had happened too quickly for his mind to catch up. But then my mother yanked him backward, and his expression hardened. They ran. They ran out of the church, out of the building, past a memorial table my father's friends had set up with photos of him in uniform. They ran across the parking lot as if the devil himself were chasing them. The pastor shouted for someone to write down their license plate. A man near the back doors, a local city councilman I recognized from community meetings, pulled out his phone and recorded the entire escape. I heard someone else say, "Lock the doors," but the damage was already done. My vision flickered. The world grew dim around the edges like a tunnel closing in. I felt hands trying to hold pressure on my wound. I heard my name shouted again and again. "Evelyn, stay with us. Evelyn, keep your eyes open." The floor beneath me felt cold. My father's casket was only a few feet away. My tears mixed with the blood on my hands. Everything felt surreal, as if I were floating above the chaos rather than lying at the center of it. A woman leaned over me and whispered, "We are here. We are not leaving you." Her voice trembled. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. Someone yelled that the ambulance had arrived. Someone else cursed because the doors were jammed by the crowd trying to help. I felt hands lifting me, heard the clatter of a stretcher being raised, the familiar medical jargon bouncing through the room. BP dropping. We need to move. Getting vitals. She is going shocky. Through all the noise, one thought echoed relentlessly in my mind. My mother left me to die. As paramedics rushed me out of the church, the last thing I saw was the stained glass window above the altar. Light streamed through it, colors bending into gold and red across the aisle, landing on the place where my mother had stood moments earlier. And then the world faded. Light hit my eyes before sound did. A sharp, blinding fluorescence cut through the darkness I had been drifting in, and for a moment I felt weightless, suspended somewhere between dreaming and dying. Then everything rushed back in a single crushing wave. The church, the knife, my mother running, my father's casket only a few feet away as I bled on the floor. My eyes fluttered open and the ceiling tiles came into focus one square at a time. Familiar, white, sterile. The steady beep of a heart monitor echoed nearby. Someone said she is waking up, and a shadow leaned into view. It took me a second to recognize the face, but when I did, my chest tightened. It was Claire, one of my co-workers, a night shift nurse who had held my hand through dozens of chaotic trauma cases, but had never expected to find me lying in the bed instead of standing beside it. "Evelyn," she whispered, her voice trembling at the edges. "You are in the emergency department. You were brought in from a stabbing." I tried to speak, but only a dry rasp escaped my throat. Claire reached for a cup of water with a straw and guided it to my lips. The water tasted metallic, but it soothed the burning in my mouth. My abdomen throbbed, a dull ache deep and heavy as though someone had planted a stone beneath my ribs. When I shifted slightly, pain flared through my side and my breath hitched. Claire placed a hand on my shoulder. "Do not move too much. You lost a lot of blood, but you are stable now." I blinked slowly, absorbing her words. Stable. Alive. The curtain around my bed rustled and a doctor stepped in. I recognized him immediately. Dr. Singh. Calm under pressure. Steady hands. The kind of doctor you prayed would be on shift during a mass casualty. He looked at me with a mixture of relief and controlled anger, the kind that only appears when medical staff see one of their own hurt. "Welcome back, Evelyn," he said with a voice that tried to stay professional but carried frustration. "You are lucky." The knife missed major arteries by less than an inch. Another half inch, and we would be having a very different conversation. My throat tightened. I forced myself to ask the question clawing at my mind. "How long have I been here?" "About 6 hours," Claire answered. "You went straight into surgery." She hesitated. It was bad. My chest rose and fell shakily. I closed my eyes, pulling fragments of memory together. The church, the scream, the pain, the sight of my mother grabbing Ray's wrist and fleeing through the doorway while I lay dying. My pulse spiked. Dr. Singh noticed. "You are safe," he said firmly. "Detectives have been here. They want to speak with you when you are able." The word detective snapped everything back into sharp focus. My eyes opened. "Are they caught?" Claire and Dr. Singh exchanged a quick look. Claire shook her head. "Not yet, but witnesses gave statements. The police have their names, their vehicle description, and someone recorded them running out of the church. They will not get far." I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry again, because disbelief twisted inside my chest. Not shock about Ray attacking me. I had always known he was capable of violence, but my mother leaving with him, leaving me on the floor of a church while I bled across the aisle from my father's casket. That betrayal cut deeper than the blade. The curtain rustled again and 2 detectives walked in. A woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a notebook already in hand, and a younger man with a badge clipped to his belt, and the expression of someone trying not to show how shaken he was by the scene they had come from. "Detective Carver," the woman said, introducing herself. "This is Detective Miles. We are sorry to meet you under these circumstances." I nodded weakly. Carver stepped closer. "We know this is difficult, but we need to ask a few questions to help locate the suspects." Suspects. Hearing the word forced the situation into stark clarity. I was a victim of a criminal attack, not an accident, not a family argument, but a felony assault with a deadly weapon. Detective Miles spoke first. Witnesses told us that the man who stabbed you is Raymond Dalton. He is believed to be in a relationship with your mother, Linda Hart. Believed to be, as if their decades-long affair had ever been subtle. Detective Carver continued. Can you confirm their relationship? I nodded. Yes, for years. She wrote something down. And did you feel threatened by either of them before today? I hesitated, not because I was unsure, but because answering meant admitting the truth out loud. Finally, I said yes. Ray has been violent for as long as I can remember. My mother encouraged him. They both wanted my father's land. My voice broke. He tried to stop them. Carver's eyes softened, but her voice remained steady. Did your father ever report threats or violence to law enforcement? I shook my head. He never wanted to make it worse. He tried to handle it alone. They exchanged another look, one that said everything without words. A pattern of abuse, a threat ignored, and now an attack. Carver closed her notebook gently. We will issue a bolo for both suspects within the next hour. State Patrol will be alerted. They cannot hide for long. I thought of my father's video diaries sitting in my bag under the hospital bed, the ones he had recorded in fear, the ones he had hoped I would never need. They were not just evidence, they were his voice, his warning, his truth. My breath shook as I said softly, my father left proof. Videos, a will, a deed. They took everything from his house, but they did not get what he gave to his lawyer. Carver straightened. That will help us considerably. When you are stable, we will take a full statement, but for now, rest. They left quietly, pulling the curtain closed behind them. Claire adjusted my IV line and smoothed the blanket across my legs. She stayed for a moment longer than necessary, her eyes glassy with emotion. When she finally stepped away, I stared at the ceiling again, watching the fluorescent lights blur into streaks. I had survived the stabbing. I was alive. But something inside me had been severed, not just trust, not just safety, something deeper, a truth I could no longer ignore. My father had been right. This was never about family. It was about greed, about control, about taking everything from him and now from me. They had left me to die in a church beside my father's coffin. But I was not dead, and the moment my strength returned, I would finish what he started. I woke again a few hours later this time to the soft hum of machines and the faint voices of nurses changing shifts outside my curtain. My abdomen still ached, but the fog in my mind had lifted slightly. The haze of anesthesia was fading, replaced by a sharper awareness of where I was, why I was there, and what had been taken from me. When the curtain slid open, I expected another nurse, maybe a tech checking vitals. Instead, I saw Michael Reeves standing at the foot of my bed, holding the same brown envelope he had shown me in his office. He looked tired, his shirt slightly wrinkled as if he had rushed here the moment he heard what happened. My heart clenched. I tried to sit up, but the pain shot through my abdomen and I froze. Reeves hurried forward. Easy. Do not push it. You just came out of surgery. His voice was calm, steady, but there was an edge beneath it, anger barely contained. He pulled a chair beside my bed and sat placing the envelope in his lap. I heard the news, he said quietly. The whole town did. I swallowed hard, the memory of the stabbing flashing across my mind like a violent echo. They left me there, I whispered. My mother ran. Reeves nodded once, jaw tightening. I believe it. They have been planning something for a long time. He tapped the envelope lightly with his fingers. That is why your father came to me when he did. This is what he left you. I stared at the envelope. It felt heavier than paper. He pulled out the transfer on death deed first and set it gently on my blanket. I traced the notary stamp with my eyes, the recorded date, the signatures. Solid, official, legal. Your father signed this 6 weeks before he passed, Reeves explained, and he made sure it met every requirement so no one could dispute it. My voice trembled. But they filed something else. Something fake. Reeves nodded. They submitted fraudulent documents within 48 hours of the obituary being printed. That is not normal timing for a grieving widow. The county clerk flagged it for review, but your mother pushed hard. She insisted your father was confused in his final weeks and that she was simply following his wishes. My stomach twisted. My father had been the clearest, most grounded man I knew. He would rather break a bone than sign something he did not understand. She lied. She always lies. Reeves opened the envelope further and laid the updated will beside the deed. I recognized my father's handwriting immediately. He had always written with deliberate strokes, the kind that revealed patience and discipline. His signature curved with the same familiar swoop at the end. My throat tightened. I touched the paper as if touching him. Reeves spoke carefully. This will supersede anything else. You are the sole beneficiary of the house, the land, the workshop, everything he owned. They have nothing if this stands. Tears blurred my vision. I asked him how close my father had been to filing everything before he died. Reeves exhaled, leaning back slightly. Very close. He planned to bring the final packet the morning after he called me last. He never showed. My breath caught. So the day he planned to secure everything was the day he... I could not finish the sentence. Reeves nodded slowly, the movement heavy with implication. Yes. That is why he came to you, why he filmed those videos. He knew something was happening. He just did not know how quickly. Reeves placed the 3 flash drives on the blanket. These are the most important things he left. I stared at them, remembering the videos I had watched in his office. My father speaking softly into the camera. My father documenting every threat. My father warning me. Reeves continued. These recordings are evidence, not just for the property dispute. They document harassment, coercion, threats of physical harm, financial manipulation, and possibly premeditation. I closed my eyes as a wave of grief hit me. He had been scared. My father, the man who faced war zones and storms and every hardship life threw at him. Reeves's voice softened. He did everything he could to protect you, and now you need to protect what he left. The curtain rustled again. Detective Carver stepped inside her notepad, already in hand. Detective Miles followed, nodding respectfully toward Reeves. Ms. Hart, Detective Carver said we need to discuss next steps. I shifted slightly in the bed, wincing at the pain. Reeves stayed seated but angled himself as if ready to intervene if needed. Carver spoke gently but directly. We have a statewide bolo out for both Raymond Dalton and Linda Hart. Their vehicle was caught on a gas station camera heading north toward Tennessee. We believe they are trying to leave the state. My pulse quickened. Of course they were. Running was what people did when they knew they were guilty. Did they take anything from the house? Carver nodded. Based on statements from neighbors, they removed several bags and boxes before leaving. We believe these items might include financial documents or personal effects belonging to your father. I felt a sharp, bitter frustration burn in my chest. They stripped the house. They emptied the workshop. They took everything they thought could rewrite the truth. But they missed the one person who could not be erased. My father and his videos. Carver continued. We will need all the evidence you have from Mr. Reeves. Video diaries, paperwork, anything your father gave him. I hesitated, then nodded. Reeves placed a protective hand over the envelope. You will have everything he told Carver, but I will be handling supervision of the material. These documents are legally protected and need chain of custody handling. Carver nodded, respectful. Understood. She turned to me again. Ms. Hart, were you aware of any threats against your father before he died? My voice cracked. Yes, Ray threatened him, more than once. And my mother was always pushing him to sign papers. They both wanted the land. Miles asked the next question, his expression troubled. Did your father ever believe they might hurt him? I swallowed hard. He recorded videos. He said he was scared. He said he did not trust them. Carver's expression sharpened as she wrote quickly. That aligns with what witnesses told us. Several neighbors said your father seemed on edge in recent weeks. One even said he hinted something was wrong at home. She paused. Did he ever mention a fall? The fall that supposedly killed him. The word fall tasted bitter. My voice lowered. My father was strong. He was careful. He would not fall down a staircase. Carver nodded slowly, closing her notebook. We will be opening an investigation into the circumstances surrounding his death. My heart raced. A suspicious death investigation. The words filled the room like cold air. Reeves placed a steady hand on my wrist. "You are not alone in this." The detectives stepped back, giving me space. Reeves gathered the documents, the will, the deed, the flash drives, and returned them to the envelope. Then he handed it to me with deliberate seriousness. "Your father trusted you to finish this, Evelyn, and you will." I gripped the envelope, the weight of it anchoring me to something stronger than fear. My father had prepared everything, and now the truth was no longer buried. It was documented. It was undeniable. It was mine to deliver. The court date arrived faster than I expected. Maybe it was because the sheriff's department had already been pursuing Ray and my mother across 2 states. Or maybe it was because the community outrage was impossible to ignore. The stabbing at my father's funeral had spread through Asheville like wildfire. Everyone had a story, everyone had an opinion, and everyone wanted justice. By the time the arraignment was scheduled, the courthouse lawn was lined with reporters, neighbors, veterans who had served with my father, and curious onlookers who had never exchanged a word with any of us yet felt deeply invested in the scandal that had consumed our town. I arrived in a wheelchair pushed by Claire. My abdomen was still tender, the stitches pulling with every shift of my weight. Reeves walked alongside us carrying the thick envelope that held the will, the deed, and my father's video diaries. My hands trembled slightly in my lap, not from fear of being in the same building as my attackers, but from the enormity of what was about to happen. This was the day the truth would be dragged into the light. Detectives Carver and Miles greeted us at the security entrance. They had both been working non-stop. Carver gave me a small nod of reassurance. "Are you ready?" I nodded. Ready was not the right word, but it was the only one that fit. Inside the courtroom, the air crackled with tension. People filled every bench. I felt dozens of eyes turn as I entered, some filled with sympathy, others with righteous fury. At the front of the room stood the prosecutor, a stern woman named Franklin, with a reputation for being relentless in cases involving domestic violence. She had reviewed my father's videos and called them one of the clearest patterns of coercion and danger she had ever seen. Ray was escorted in first by 2 deputies. His wrists were cuffed. His eyes darted around the room, flicking between the reporters and the spectators. When he finally saw me, his face twisted with something between hatred and panic. My mother entered second. She wore a wrinkled blouse and her hair was uncombed, but even then she carried herself with a strange arrogance, as if she believed this entire situation was beneath her. When her eyes landed on me, something cold flashed across her face. Not guilt. Not regret, annoyance, as if I were the one who had inconvenienced her by surviving. The judge entered and called the room to order. The prosecutor began by outlining the charges: attempted murder, assault with a deadly weapon, fraud, forgery, conspiracy to commit fraud. A hush fell over the spectators. Then the prosecutor addressed the central question: motive. She stepped toward the projector screen, clicked a remote, and the first frame of one of my father's video diaries appeared. The room went dead silent. My father's face filled the screen, worn and tired, the workshop lights casting shadows across his features. His voice played across the speakers. "If you are watching this, something has gone wrong." He described the pressure my mother and Ray had been putting on him. He described their demands, their manipulations, the threats that had escalated in the weeks leading to his death. He described Ray slamming him into a door frame. He described my mother using guilt like a weapon. With each word, the courtroom shifted. People leaned forward. Others covered their mouths. Someone whispered, "Dear God." The prosecutor then played the next video, and the next. Videos of my father speaking softly, the strain in his voice unmistakable. "I do not trust them. They want the land. I fear they may do something drastic." Each recording built a devastating timeline, a pattern of coercion, a pattern of fear, a pattern of escalating danger. My mother's face drained of color. Ray clenched his jaw so tightly I thought he might crack a tooth. The prosecutor stepped aside as the final video played. In this one, my father looked directly into the camera as if he were speaking to all of us in the room. "Protect the land, kid. Do not let them take it. I love you." My eyes burned. I could feel the entire room holding its breath. When the video ended, the prosecutor turned toward the defendants. Tom Hart feared for his life. And he was right to. The forensic handwriting expert then testified, confirming that the documents filed by my mother were forged. The notary stamp was fake. The signature was replicated. The deed they tried to pass off was invalid. Then the prosecutor presented the real deed, the one Reeves had kept safe, the one that transferred the land to me legally. The judge accepted it into evidence. My mother stood abruptly shouting that she was his wife, that she deserved the property, that I had manipulated him. The judge slammed his gavel. "Sit down or you will be removed." But she kept shouting, voice rising in panic, until 2 deputies escorted her back to her seat. Ray broke next. He stood and yelled that my father had been weak, that he had provoked him, that the stabbing had been an accident. But multiple witnesses testified that he had lunged at me deliberately, that he had been shouting, that he had been intoxicated, that the knife had been open and ready. Then the city councilman who recorded their escape took the stand. He described how my mother had grabbed Ray and fled the church while I lay bleeding. He described their speed, their panic, their refusal to check if I was alive. The prosecutor played the video of them running across the parking lot. The courtroom reacted with shock and disgust. Finally, the judge delivered the ruling. "Raymond Dalton, you are hereby sentenced to 18 years in state prison for attempted murder, felony, assault, fraud, and conspiracy." My mother's face twisted in horror. "Linda Hart for forgery, fraud, and conspiracy to defraud the estate of Thomas Hart. You are sentenced to 6 years in state prison." A ripple of approval passed through the spectators. My mother shouted my name as if I had done this to her, as if her own actions had not carved the path to this very moment. The judge banged the gavel again. "The land house and workshop of Thomas Hart are legally restored to his daughter Evelyn Hart according to the valid deed on file." My breath hitched. Relief washed through me in a slow, powerful wave. Reeves squeezed my shoulder gently. "It is done," he whispered. "They cannot take anything else." Reporters gathered outside as deputies led Ray and my mother away in handcuffs. Cameras flashed, voices rose, a storm of questions filled the air. But all of it faded when Reeves leaned down and said softly, "Your father would be proud of you." As Claire pushed my wheelchair through the courthouse doors, sunlight hit my face. Warm, bright, steady. For the first time since my father died, I felt something I had not felt in weeks. Justice. The aftermath of the trial unfolded like the slow unwinding of a storm, not with thunder or chaos, but with a steady erosion of everything my mother and Ray had built on lies. News of the sentencing spread through Asheville faster than I could process it. People who had once smiled politely at my mother in church now crossed the street to avoid being associated with her. Neighbors who had tolerated Ray's drunken shouting now spoke about him in lowered voices, shaking their heads as if trying to make sense of how far things had spiraled. For the first time in my life, the town stopped giving them the benefit of the doubt. They saw them clearly without the polished veneer my mother had always tried to present. I watched this change from a distance, not with satisfaction exactly, but with a weary understanding that this was simply the natural consequence of the truth coming to light. My mother had always cared about 2 things more than anything else: how people perceived her and how much control she could exert over those around her. Prison took both from her instantly. She had no audience, no reputation to polish, no one to order around. She was forced into a system where her manipulation meant nothing and her charm held no value. The first letter arrived 2 weeks after the sentencing. I recognized her handwriting immediately. Sharp, pressed, determined to dominate even the envelope it sat on. Inside, her words spilled across the page in elaborate loops. "Evelyn, I know you think you're doing what is right, but you do not understand the full picture. I was under tremendous stress when all this happened. You have twisted everything to make me look like the villain. I am your mother. You owe me compassion. You owe me support. You owe me loyalty." And at the bottom, almost as an afterthought, fix this. I read it once, then again. I waited for any flicker of guilt to rise in me, any familiar pull toward trying to placate her, anything that remained of that old reflex to repair what she broke. There was nothing. I folded the letter neatly, placed it back in the envelope, and dropped it into the trash without responding. Prison did not soften my mother. It sharpened her bitterness. Over the next month, more letters arrived. Some pleaded, some accused. Some were filled with rambling excuses and rewritten histories that painted her as the victim and me as the architect of her downfall. Not once did she apologize. Not once did she acknowledge my father's suffering. Not once did she ask if I was healing from the wound Ray had driven into my abdomen. Every letter made one thing clearer: she had not lost her capacity for cruelty. She had only lost her audience. Ray's downfall was even harsher. News traveled through the correctional system quickly. A man who stabbed an unarmed woman at a funeral drunk over greed rather than desperation was not someone who earned respect inside. He was labeled as a coward, someone who preyed on vulnerability, someone who abused a grieving daughter. In prisons across the United States, there are hierarchies, unspoken rules, and different crimes carry different levels of scorn. The men who saw him enter the block saw the weakness in his eyes immediately. Ray lasted only 3 days before his attorney contacted the court requesting protective custody. He claimed he feared for his safety. He claimed he had been threatened. He claimed that inmates had cornered him in the yard and called him names I do not care to repeat. He was moved to a segregated unit cut off from the general population. A man who had spent his life puffing his chest, shouting to make himself seem larger, acting as if he were untouchable, now sat in a small cell alone for 23 hours a day. It was a poetic justice I had not needed to witness to understand. Meanwhile, life outside prison adapted without them. The community's response was swift and unforgiving. The church removed my mother's name from every committee she had once lorded over. The women's club cut ties with her. The storekeepers who used to greet her with a smile now avoided the conversation entirely. Some people approached me when I ran errands in town. They spoke quietly, gently. "We had no idea. We are so sorry for what you went through. Your father deserved better." And though condolences often stirred my grief, I accepted them with gratitude. They reminded me that my father had been seen respected and valued even when my mother worked tirelessly to undermine him. One afternoon, I received a call from Detective Carver. "I have some news," he said, his tone even but thoughtful. "We received the final report from the medical examiner. There was evidence of a struggle before your father's fall. Bruising on his arm consistent with someone grabbing him forcefully. Defensive marks." My chest tightened. So it had not just been my father's fear in those videos. There had been something more, something physical, something desperate. Carver continued, "We are not pursuing further charges against your mother or Ray for his death because of the lack of direct eyewitnesses, but we believe your father's suspicions were valid." He paused. "I want you to know something. Your father fought." I closed my eyes and let those words settle. He fought. For his land, for his name, for me. And in the end, I had fought for him too. Weeks passed, then months. I focused on healing. Claire often reminded me that trauma nurses were not known for slowing down, but even she insisted I respect the limits of my recovery. Some nights when the pain in my abdomen flared, I touched the scar lightly and told myself it did not represent what they tried to take from me. It represented what I survived. One evening, another letter arrived from the prison, this one addressed in Ray's handwriting. I hesitated before opening it. His message was short and uneven, the script shaky. "Evelyn, I did not mean for things to go that way. Your father always hated me. Your mother pushed me. Everything got out of hand. I never meant to stab you. It was an accident. You have to believe me. You are the reason my life is ruined. Tell them to reconsider my sentence. You owe me that much." I stared at the letter in disbelief before letting out a quiet laugh. A humorless one. He had not changed either. He had not taken ownership. He had not apologized. He had not even addressed me with humanity. Just more demands, more blame, more denial. I folded it slowly, slid it back into the envelope, and fed it into the shredder under my desk. It felt symbolic, final, quiet. My mother and Ray had expected to dismantle my world and walk away unscathed. But in the end, they were the ones left standing in the ruins they had made. I was rebuilding. They were confined. And for the first time in my life, I felt the weight of their influence shrinking until it held no power over me at all. The first morning I woke up in my father's house after the verdict felt strangely hollow, not in a painful way, but in the way an old battlefield feels after the smoke clears and silence returns. The walls no longer carried the echo of arguments, accusations, or my mother's cutting voice. Instead, the house felt like it was waiting for breath, waiting for purpose, waiting for me. Claire had driven me home from the courthouse insisting on helping me inside, even though I told her a dozen times I could walk. She looked around the living room and let out a soft exhale. "It is peaceful here." I nodded. Peaceful was the right word, although it felt unfamiliar on my tongue. After she left, I walked slowly through each room, touching the edges of shelves, the corners of door frames, the scarred wooden floorboards my father had installed himself. Everything carried traces of him. The little workshop apron he always hung near the door, the chipped ceramic mug he refused to replace, the marks on the wall from when he moved furniture without bothering to measure first. The land outside looked vast and quiet, rolling into the tree line that bordered the acreage he had protected so fiercely. I stepped out onto the porch, the late autumn air cool and crisp. Standing there, I felt a weight lift from my chest. Not entirely, not suddenly, but enough that I could take a deeper breath than I had in weeks. The land was mine now, legally, permanently, undisputed. But more importantly, it was safe, protected from people who never deserved it in the first place. I walked to the workshop next. The smell of sawdust hit me the moment I opened the door. My father's tools were still arranged in the meticulous way only he understood. The workbench held unfinished projects, sketches, and wood pieces sanded halfway. For the first time since his death, I allowed myself to imagine him standing there again, sleeves rolled up, humming quietly to whatever classic rock station he always tuned to. Tears rose, but this time they were not sharp. They were warm, necessary. I sat at his workbench and traced the worn edges with my fingers. I whispered into the empty room. "I kept it, Dad. Nobody took it from us." That afternoon I called Reeves. I told him I wanted to reopen Hart Woodworks not as a business for profit, but as a tribute to my father, a place where veterans and young tradesmen could learn craftsmanship from volunteer instructors, a place where community mattered. Reeves listened quietly, then cleared his throat in that way he always did when something moved him. "Tom would like that," he said softly. A week later, with the help of a few neighbors who had admired my father for years, we cleared out the workshop and organized everything. They shared stories I had never heard, about how my father had fixed their porch steps without accepting payment, about how he had made custom frames for a couple's anniversary photos, about the handmade rocking chair he donated to a single mom he barely knew. He helped everyone, one neighbor said, shaking his head fondly. He just did it quietly. I smiled, swallowing the ache that rose in my throat again. That was the man he was. And now, for the first time, I felt ready to continue what he left behind. Within a month, Hart Woodworks reopened as a community workshop. The turnout surprised me. Retired veterans, high school kids, carpenters who remembered buying tools from my dad decades earlier. They came with their stories, their gratitude, their respect. It felt like the beginning of something healing. Not just for me, for all of us who had loved him. In the middle of all this rebuilding, I returned to the hospital part-time. The first time I stepped back into the ER, the familiar sounds washed over me. Monitors beeping, voices calling out vital signs, stretchers rolling briskly through the hallways. It felt strange at first seeing my coworkers look at me with a mixture of relief and protectiveness. But then it felt grounding, as if part of my identity had finally aligned again. I realized something as I walked those halls. I had survived more than a stab wound. I had survived years of emotional corrosion, the kind you do not notice until it has carved deep grooves into your life. And now those grooves were filling with something new: strength, purpose, clarity. One evening after a long shift, I returned home and found a thick envelope in my mailbox. The handwriting made my heart stop. It was my father's. I recognized the way he wrote my name. Upright, solid, steady. I carried the envelope inside with trembling hands, sat at the kitchen table, and broke the seal. Inside was a letter he had written years ago, tucked away in a file. Reeves only delivered once the court case had ended. "My dearest Evelyn," he began, "if you are reading this, then life took a turn neither of us wanted." He wrote about watching me grow into the woman he admired more than anyone. He wrote about how proud he was that I became a nurse, about how he saw in me the courage and compassion that had defined his own years in the Marines. Then he wrote something that made me press a hand to my mouth. "I know you have spent your life thinking you needed to be strong for everyone else. For me, for your patients, even for your mother. But you do not have to carry the world alone. You deserve a life that feels full, a life that feels yours, a life built on soil that loves you back." I leaned back, letting tears fall freely. Then came the final paragraph. "If you kept the land, if you fought for it, if you protected what mattered, then I know you found your strength. I know you honored me in the best way possible. But now, kid, I need you to do something else. Live. Live loud. Live honest. Live without fear. Turn this place into something good, something lasting, something that reflects your heart, because that is what I always trusted the most." I rested the letter against my chest and whispered, "I will, Dad. I promise." From that moment, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. In addition to reopening the workshop, I established the Tom Hart Memorial Nursing Scholarship, dedicated to supporting young students pursuing trauma and emergency nursing. It launched with donations from locals who had watched the trial unfold. People wanted to help. They wanted to honor him. They wanted to honor what he had stood for. Months passed, each one filled with slow, deliberate steps toward healing. Not the dramatic version of healing people talk about, but the real kind. The kind that comes in small moments. Drinking coffee on the porch my father built. Reading through his old notebooks. Teaching a teenager how to sand a piece of cedar without splintering it. Sitting in the workshop late at night listening to the hum of the forest. One early morning before the sun fully rose, I walked to his grave. The grass around the headstone was damp with dew. A faint breeze moved through the pines. I knelt down, pressed my palm to the cool granite, and let myself feel everything at once. Grief, love, relief, pride, peace. "Dad," I said softly, "I kept your land, I kept your name, and I kept your legacy. Thank you for teaching me how to fight the right battles. Thank you for trusting me to finish what you started." I stood slowly, breathing in the crisp air that tasted like a beginning. When I walked back toward the house, the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees and spilled across the porch. Warm, gentle, steady. A promise of the life still ahead of me. A life not defined by violence or betrayal, but by everything I had reclaimed, everything I had protected, everything I had built. My war was over. My world was mine. And every day from now on, I would live in a way that honored that victory. Wherever you are watching from tonight, I would ask later on my channel, and whatever battles you have survived, what would you have done in my place? If you have stayed with me through every step of this journey, from the moment I stood beside my father's casket to the long nights I spent rebuilding what was stolen, then I want to speak directly to you now. Stories like mine are not just entertainment. They are reflections of the quiet wars many people fight behind closed doors, battles against betrayal, manipulation, and the kind of family wounds that take years to understand and even longer to heal. If you have ever been the one who stood up alone, the one who spoke truth when everyone else stayed silent, the one who refused to let someone rewrite your story, then I hope you felt seen here. My father taught me that strength does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it shakes, sometimes it bleeds, but it still stands. And standing is enough. When I was lying on the floor of that church, fading in and out of consciousness, I thought the world was ending. It never crossed my mind that it was actually beginning. I did not know then that the truth would rise, that the lies would crumble, that justice would catch up even after years of hiding. I did not know I would reclaim my home. I did not know I would build something new from the ashes. I did not know peace could return. But it did. And if you are going through something dark right now, I want you to remember this life has a way of circling back to truth. It may take time. It may take courage you do not think you have. It may take walking through fire. But the truth holds. The truth survives. The truth waits for its moment to step forward. And when it does, everything changes. So tonight, wherever you are watching from, I want you to take a moment and breathe. Maybe you are sitting in your living room with a cup of tea after a long day. Maybe you are lying in bed replaying your own family battles. Maybe you are driving home from work listening because you needed a voice that understood real pain, real betrayal, real resilience. Wherever you are, thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for giving stories like mine a space to exist, because every time someone hears them, someone else feels less alone. My father once told me that legacy is not about money or land or buildings. Legacy is about what you leave inside the people who loved you. I carry his legacy in every breath I take on this land. I carry it in every piece of cedar I sand in his workshop. I carry it in every nursing student who receives a scholarship in his name. And in telling this story, I hope a piece of that legacy reaches you too. Before we end tonight, I want to ask the question I ask at the end of every story, because your voice matters here. Your experiences matter. Your perspective matters. So tell me, where are you watching from right now? What city or state or quiet little corner of the world are you in? And if you were standing in my shoes on that day in that church, hearing those words, facing that danger, carrying that truth, what would you have done? I read every comment. I learn from every story you share, and your courage becomes part of this community just as much as mine. Until the next story, take care of yourself. Protect your peace. And remember, even after the darkest chapters, there is always a page waiting to be turned.